Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your Air Force Association Airmen in the Fight series. Our focus is on our mission to support dominant air and space forces and our Air Force and Space Force leadership, and certainly their families. I'm your host for this afternoon, Orville Wright, your Air Force Association president. And joining us today, we're honored, all the way from Yokota Air Base in Japan at 6 o'clock in the morning. Today is Tuesday here, so it's Wednesday there, as Lieutenant General Kevin Gumby Schneider, the Commander U.S. Forces Japan, and dual-hatted as the Commander 5th Air Force. And along with General Schneider, his Vice Commander for 5th Air Force, Brigadier General Leo Kaczynski, and the Command Chief Master Sergeant of 5th Air Force, Katie McCool. It's great to see you all too. So before we start today, it's important always for your Air Force Association to thank our sponsors, our partners in strengthening the Department of the Air Force and industry team to stay ahead of the dawning threats, really unprecedented dawning threats that we face today. So thanks to Collins Aerospace, Elbit America, General Dynamics, GE Aviation, L3Harris, Lockheed Martin, Next Era Energy, Oracle, Pratt & Whitney, the Pentagon Federal Credit Union, Raytheon, the Roosevelt Group, and SAIC. A bit more on introductions. Lieutenant General Schneider is also the senior military representative in Japan and works very closely with U.S. Embassy Japan, the Department of State leadership in Tokyo. And he's also responsible for managing bilateral security issues. So he works directly with the most senior leadership of the Japanese government, including their Minister of Defense, the equivalent for their Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and for the Japanese, their Air Chief. So a lot of times strengthening the U.S.-Japan security alliance, and also administers the status of forces agreement supporting families and our presence, U.S. presence in Japan. And that includes, of course, improving combat readiness, exercises, and enhancing quality of life for some 62,000 military and Department of Defense civilian personnel, and some 42,000 family members. General Schneider was commissioned from the Air Force Academy in 1988. He's a graduate of the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program and the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, where he also taught. He is commanded at the squadron, group, and wing levels, including a combat wing in the Middle East. And he's held staff assignments at the most senior levels on the Air Staff, U.S. Air Force's Central Command, Pacific Air Forces, Indo-PACOM, and the Joint Staff. He's also a command pilot, a current F-16 pilot with more than 3,800 flying hours in the F-15E, the F-16, the T-38, including some 535 combat hours in Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. General Schneider, again, we're honored that you're going to share your perspectives, and we should have time for some questions and answers with the audience. And as we get to the end of General Schneider's comments, just use the raised hand function for the some almost 500 participants today with us on this Zoom call. And you can also submit questions in writing, and I'll moderate the Q&A. So Kevin, again, the stage is yours, and thanks again so much that you and your team are with us today, your Air Force Association and audience, and many from across the Department of the Air Force and industry who've joined us here today. Thanks again.
Sir, thank you very much. Just want to do one last comm check with you just to make sure I'm coming across loud and clear on that end. Excellent.
Yeah, loud and clear here.
And sir, thank you for the introduction. Now I have to live up to it. As you mentioned, I wear two hats, so I will apologize to the audience. One of the hats is Joint, the USFJ Commander. The other hat is Air Force, as 5th Air Force Commander. As I go through my prepared remarks, I'm going to probably intertwine some of those responsibilities, and I will apologize if I conflate things. So please call me out in the Q&A if there's something I said that didn't make sense from one perspective or the other. I will admit, when I looked at the list of people that had registered for this event, it was pretty intimidating. A number of people that have sat in this office had this position before. a large number of former bosses, and then a pretty good contingent of people that just know me. So recognize me for the inarticulate knuckle dragger that I truly am. So I'll keep my remarks short, but leave time for the Q&A, and I've got two experts to help me out. If I could, what I'd like to do is kind of maybe start from a strategic overview and then draw down a little bit. And I'm going to start off with this statement, which I can make because of where I sit. And it's this, and it's the U.S.-Japan alliance is the most important alliance that the United States has. My boss at INDOPACOM, Admiral Davidson, will use the phrase most consequential alliance. I'd be happy to argue with anybody later about the implications of both hard power and soft power that the U.S.-Japan alliance has, both from a military/self-defense force perspective, but also from a shared values perspective and reach. As we look at the strategic documents in the United States and our national security strategy, our national defense strategy, as well as their counterparts in Japan, whether the National Defense Planning Guidance and the MTDP, you're going to see very similar language. And then the two documents, the two sets of strategic documents line up pretty well against each other. And they both recognize, in order, the PRC, the DPRK, and Russia as challenges. However, it's the next step below that occupies a lot of my time, and there are times and aspects of those strategic documents that aren't implemented necessarily at the same speed or the same intensity, and that drives a little bit of a friction in the U.S. alliance at times. But I keep getting reminded by both people and those in Japan that I work with, and even those in the United States. Japan is a sovereign nation. They're going to do things based on the fact that they're Japan, and they're going to do things in their own national interest. But we continue to work through those to try to drive, alignment in operationalization of the national security documents on both sides. I will say that Japan is the greatest power projection platform that we have in the Western Pacific. I will also say that it is going to be contested in almost any scenario that involves the PRC, DPRK, and Russia. And at times, people have used the phrase, Japan is a safe haven, or Japan is the unsinkable aircraft carrier. And I'm challenging those assumptions. I agree it's probably unsinkable. However, it can be made unusable if we're not careful about how we defend it. So for all of our O plans, for all of our contingencies, and all the thinking that goes into how we would deal with anything that goes on out here in the Pacific, trying to drive energy into the fact that we need to think about doing things differently because of the rapid evolution of the threat that we face in this neighborhood. Particularly that posed by Beijing and PLA forces. So I'll transition kind of into the neighborhood, and I think everybody understands, kind of the neighborhood in which Japan lives and operates. And first on that list is the PRC. A couple of years ago, Japan's annual defense white paper placed the PRC threat above that posed by DPRK, which I think is great, and I think it is a sober and realistic understanding of the environment out here. Japanese leadership is very concerned about the rapid expansion of a PLA offensive capability. In most every engagement I will have with Japanese senior leaders, especially Minister of Defense, as well as their chairman of the JJS, we'll talk about the growth of the exponential growth of the PLA's defense budget, and then what they're doing both with missile capabilities, air capabilities, ground and maritime. I will say this: when I first came into the job, and I tried to have conversations about the Chinese threat, and I was really full of fire and brimstone after almost 3 years at INDOPACOM and listening to both Admiral Harris and Admiral Davidson, and trying to drive home the same talking points about Chinese malign influence that stretched all the way from the Panama Canal, through Europe, One Belt, One Road, around the Indian Ocean, all the way back into the South China Sea and into Oceania. The response I would typically get was that the Japanese perspective of the PRC, malign influence extended to the East China Sea and then to a little bit beyond that into the South China Sea. And they're certainly focused on what's going on in the Senkakus, not just during fishing season, but on a daily basis. Over my time here, a little short of 2 years, that conversation has expanded, and I think for all the right reasons. And you'll see Japanese leaders start talking more and more about Chinese malign influence beyond what happens in the Senkakus. They talk more about the South China Sea. They came up on the net and they spoke about what took place in Hong Kong. Now, they didn't necessarily join with the United States in some of our senior leader messaging on it, but Japanese leaders did come out and talk about their concern, disappointment, and fears about what the Chinese government was doing to undermine the system in Hong Kong. And they also recognize that there are direct implications to Taiwan that come out of this as well. 2 days ago, I was pulled into a symposium on space, and I was pleasantly surprised that all the other, it was myself and 5 other experts, myself and 5 experts. I am not an expert on space, but 5 Japanese experts on space, to include 2 former ministers of defense, all talked about Chinese malign influence in space. So the conversation is expanding. The part that I still think needs to expand is that public debate or dialogue, which will allow further flexibility for the self-defense forces to do a little bit more. And I think most are tracking, the Koku Jeitai, or the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, executes over 600 scrambles a year against PLA Air Force or other PLA aircraft in the vicinity of the East China Sea every single year. And that number has continued to rise rapidly after 2012, got to a peak a couple of years ago, but still sits at 200 or 600 plus scrambles annually. And this year, we have seen record-setting incursions by Chinese Coast Guard into the Senkakus, either the territorial waters or the contiguous zones. And that is going to continue to be a problem, and we see more and more aggressive activity on the part of PLA Navy, Chinese Coast Guard, as well as their maritime militia. Moving on to DPRK. There are over 500 missiles in the DPR. We assess there's over 500 DPRK missiles that can range Japan today. And then all the other attendant capabilities that go along with the warheads there. That still has Japan concerned, and rightly so. The fact that KJU has continued to modernize the missile force, continued to do research and development, and created, new, more capable missiles with lower altitude apogees, potential for maneuvering reentry vehicles or maneuvering warheads, is of great concern here, which makes all of this, makes it tougher for the Japanese and the United States, tougher to detect, track, and intercept these missiles. And then Russia. I think most people are tracking, at the end of World War II, there was no peace treaty signed between Japan and Russia. And a lot of that is centered around territorial disputes regarding the northern territories. There was an ongoing dialogue in the Prime Minister Abe administration, about 24 high-level meetings, either at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or at the Prime Minister level, between Japan and Russia. But I think, how do I say this diplomatically, there's little to no return on investment in any of those conversations. So that continues to be a source of tension. And I mentioned the 600 plus scrambles that the Koku Jeitai executes in the East China Sea every year. They execute over 300 north of Hokkaido and into the Sea of Japan every year for Russian aviation or Russian military aviation activities. So I think the Suga administration is going to take a slightly different approach to Russia than the Abe administration, and I suspect that we may see a slight increase or uptick in terms of Russian behavior, especially in the air domain, with the Suga administration that we didn't necessarily see before. So again, I'm probably not saying anything that was unknown or comes as a surprise to anybody that has paid attention to life out in this part of the world. Well, I'll talk about briefly is my challenges. So as the USFJ commander, and as General Wright mentioned, the day-to-day management of the alliance is, first and foremost, and that, unfortunately runs the gamut from the strategic E3 that gets a DUI in Okinawa or gets into a fight, all the way up to conversations with Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the chairman of the JJS. Fantastic team here on the USFJ side of the house that works all those issues, and really couldn't be happier. But I'll put a finer edge on those challenges. Number one, I guess the thing that I focus on when I come in the door every morning is training and readiness of the U.S. forces, the joint force here in Japan. The biggest concern that I have is that most of our high-end training for the ground and air forces, for the U.S. forces that are stationed here in this country, most of that high-end training has to be outsourced to third party or other locations to happen. We don't have the training ranges, we don't have the airspace, and we don't have the freedom of maneuver flexibility that I would like for forces to maintain their highest level of readiness. And that has a huge impact on deterrence. And so we work, fight, challenge every day to figure out ways that we can improve the opportunities for the forces here to train. That has become even more challenging in times of COVID. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Put the 5th Air Force hat back on again. So for not only U.S. Air Forces, but even the JASDAF forces, if you're going to do high-end training, if you are going to go out there and do the all-altitude, all-spectrum war, to include electronic warfare, dropping live bombs, mass package employment, etc., you're going to do that at a red flag. You have got to leave Japan to do that. With all the COVID restrictions in places, ROM, a restriction of movement, the bills to pay when you go to a location and when you return back to Japan, that becomes harder and harder to do. We're in another discussion right now at COPE North, which is the big annual exercise that we have held in Guam between the United States Air Force, the United States, Japan, as well as the Australian forces, which both includes kind of a high-end tactical scenario as well as a HADR scenario. And we're forced to make decisions about, do we go or do we reduce the scope, scale, and size of the effort because of COVID? But sorry, I'm getting into the weeds. Let me back out of this again to go. We need to find ways to do more with the opportunities that we have here in Japan. I believe it chips away at our deterrent value if we're having to take the show on the road and go somewhere else to train. And I think there's a lot we can do with reveal and conceal if we're able to do that here in Japan all the time, or at a greater extent than we do right now. A little bit more specifically, drawn range, or for those that are old like me, ripsaw range up at Misawa, which is a fairly unique capability. I'm concerned about range space and certainly encroachment out there, as it's our one electronic warfare / bombing range, and it's got some pretty awesome airspace associated with that. But that is in danger. That's running into some encroachment issues. Iwakuni, the airspace down at Iwakuni, which is home to the Marine Corps F-35B squadrons and 5th gen capability right now. Camp Fuji, which small, albeit in terms of airspace, but it does allow us combined arms training where we can do ground fire and do air to surface employment as well. Already low altitude training for CV-22s. All of these things are things that we work on a regular basis to try to expand and be able to do more every day. I'd say so that's number one challenge is the USFJ commander, fighting for those opportunities. Number two is force posture, which again, I think goes without saying, and I won't get into too many details in that regard, but I think many are familiar with DPRI, what's taking place in Okinawa, and relocation of forces to off of Okinawa to other parts of either Japan or other parts of the Pacific as well. But from a bigger scope, as the Chinese threat in particular continues to evolve, are our forces postured correctly here in Japan? And obviously Indo-PACOM and OSD are looking at the bigger question of our forces postured correctly in the theater, but specifically in Japan. Are we at the right bases? Are we at the do we have the capabilities we need at those bases? Are we doing things with our JSDF partners in terms of basing properly? And are there different ways that we can get after the challenges of force projection balanced with encroachment and some of the other things that are on the plate? And then third is cyber, which may seem a little bit odd, but I continue to grow more and more concerned every day about, as we continue to do more with information sharing with our ally, are those networks protected? Are we doing the right things? Are we able to pass classified, highly sensitive information in a rapid fashion in a way that keeps our adversaries from seeing or knowing what we're doing? On a 5th Air Force example, right across the street from this headquarters, and if I open my window, I can see the Kokujai's Air Defense Command headquarters, and in the basement is their Air Defense Command AOC, and we have a tremendous amount of information sharing that takes place, for maintaining that air picture, sharing information, because it is also the headquarters for their Joint Task Force Ballistic Missile Defense. But we need to make sure that those networks are protected. We need to make sure that nobody is, in those that can either disrupt, break those links, or put, malign information in there that would cause us to make poor decisions. And so as we continue to look to do more with information sharing across the spectrum, not just for the example I just gave, but everything that we do from plans to decision making to our IT networks, I'm putting a big emphasis on making sure that those networks are protected to ensure the sanctity of that information. And then I'll put the 5th Air Force hat on here at the end, and I'll just talk about my priorities here within 5th Air Force and as the 5th Air Force commander. And first and foremost is readiness. I can joke that I talk to the USFJ commander every day on this one, and we're really aligned. But certainly readiness, and I'm looking for ways, as I mentioned before, that we can train more in Japan with the forces that we have, and that's just not U.S. Air Force, but that is our Kokujai partners as well. And there is a genuine appetite that they want to do more with us every day, which is fantastic. And again, it's not only the high-end training, the examples that I mentioned with Red Flag and Cope North, but even looking to expand the ACE concept of what in the Agile Combat Employment. The Japanese are very excited about that. They participated with us in a recent exercise, homegrown exercise here in Japan, but they're looking for ways that they can do more, and I'm happy to have them do more with us. My second priority is allies and partners, with subset A there being our Japanese ally. But there are also partners in the region that we continue to work with. The forces in 5th Air Force, unlike those in 7th Air Force, have more flexibility to deploy in the region and to go elsewhere and to work with regional partners. And I'd say probably behind Japan, Australia is next on the list. But more specifically, and again, to put a little bit finer point on that, I was talking with General Wright earlier, in terms of allies and partners, F-35. Japan is buying 147 F-35s. It's a mix of A's and B's, and they have a little less than 2 dozen or a dozen and a half F-35As right now up in Misawa, and they're going to roll out the flag of their 2nd squadron here on the 15th of December. But I want us, the 5th Air Force staff and the wings and in 5th Air Force, as well as our Marine partners and PACAF staff and JPO and others, to do everything that we can to make sure that the F-35 program goes in the right direction at the speed that we need it to go. And that can be challenging. The United States has the benefit of years, of decades of 5th generation experience. Japan does not. But I want to be able to take all of our lessons learned and our experience and be able to provide that to the Japanese so that their on-ramp is steeper, faster, quicker than ours was. And I spent a lot of time at Misawa, not just flying airplanes up there, but during the regular trips up there, I do touch base with the F-35 program and the squadron, as well as their wing leadership, just to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to help that program keep its upward vector. I already talked about ACE and the Japanese interest and desire to be a part of us. They want to fight with us. They want to make sure that we are literally shoulder to shoulder in times of contingency, and that is a great thing. So definitely want to continue to bring them along and figure out ways that we can to work together, because there are certainly capabilities that they possess that we don't, and certainly access-facing aspects that the Koku-Jeitai can provide that helps us, and then BMD as well. And then the last priority, and certainly not in order, but taking care of airmen and families. And I didn't mention coronavirus or COVID up to this point, but I will here. That is obviously a major concern. I will say that we've been very successful across the Joint Force in dealing with this. We have learned a lot of lessons along the way, and we've certainly had ebbs and flows. We have had clusters or outbreaks at bases, but have been really pleased with the commanders and the command teams that they have been able to get their arms around these challenges really quickly. And it has not had an impact on mission. It has not had an impact on our ability to power project. We have not had to shut down. At times we've had to do things in terms of blue-silver teaming. We've had work from home schedules, but by and large, we've tried to advertise and we have truly executed the fact that, hey, this is business as usual out here. We're still out doing the mission. We're still out deploying, doing TDYs, and messaging that fact not only to our people, but to those in the region that would challenge the assumption that we're not ready and capable at a moment's notice to carry out any of our assigned missions. So I'll stop there. I've talked for way too long, but I would like to open it up now to see if there's any questions or comments or issues from the audience. Sir, please, back to you.
And for our audience, we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. We'll try to get as many as possible. And for those I don't get to, I apologize. We'll forward those questions and try to facilitate some answers and a continuing dialogue as AFA would facilitate for those on the net today, including the media, industry, and our military AFA members. So I'll start with the first question from Garrett Ream. Had your hand up first. Garrett, go ahead out there. Identify yourself, please, and then go ahead with your question.
Hi, yes. My name is Garrett Ream. I'm with Flight Global, aviation reporter. I wanted to ask about interoperability. There's still some animus between Japan and several other nations in the Pacific. How do you get past that when working on interoperability, especially when it comes to longer term projects such as technology that networks together and collaborating on that sort of thing?
Yeah, Garrett, it's a great question. I suspect at the root of your question is the relationship between Japan and South Korea, maybe?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That unfortunately is one of those challenges or issues that I have to be a spectator on. I continue to watch and wish that it would improve, and I realize that is not a great answer. I will say this, despite the political challenges that we see play out, there is the feeling amongst the self-defense force leaders is, I think, a recognition that a lot of the problems could be dealt with in the mill-to-mill channels. And at times, and I'll go back to an example last year when there was aviation activity by China and Russia that was taking place, that split the two ADIZs or ran the line between the two ADIZs. There is still information sharing that takes place quietly, at action officer levels and in operations centers. So, when push comes to shove, and things look like we have to be very sensitive about the way that we handle our responses to out of area aviation, that the ops centers do talk to each other. There is information sharing for the sake of safety. So that's maybe the silver lining in this whole conversation. But yeah, from a political level, I think that's something that's going to continue to have to play out, and I'm interested to see how the new administration here in Japan deals with the POTROC and the administration in Korea going forward. Again, probably not the great answer to your question.
Well, it helps. Thanks, sir. Go next to Joseph Avello. I hope
yes, sir. Avello. Sir, Cadet Avello, Purdue University. I was wondering, sir, you had mentioned about airspace and ground space constraints in the Japanese region. What is the is there potential future operations for expansion of airspace and ground space in the Japan theater of operation, or what is the timeline looking like for that in the AO, sir?
Yeah, another great question. So I'm going to throw out this phrase that anyone that's been in this around here has heard before, and it's called local understanding. So for us to do things or to change the status quo, we collectively, the U.S. and Japanese government, have to achieve some sort of local understanding with the local publics to go, hey, we want to expand range times, or we want to expand range space. So that is a tough conversation to have at times, especially because I don't know if the public dialogue about the threat being posed by China is still evolving, still developing. So I think that limits our ability to sit down with the Japanese to go, hey, I want to take this, the existing range, and I'll use Camp Fuji as an example to go, we'd like to, expand the lateral limits. We'd like to expand the operating time. We'd like to be able to do night work out there. So yes, there's aspirations and ideas to do that, but it's very slow and incremental progress going forward. And I'm sticking with the Camp Fuji example, just to be able to drop practice bombs. We have had to go toe to toe with government of Japan over local understanding to drop 25-pound non-explosive practice bombs. We're making progress on that, but it's, again, a step-by-step evolution to advance here, but we are making progress.
Thanks, sir. And go next to kind of builds on your local understanding piece from Peter Lowey, Asahi Shimbun. Asked the question, U.S.-Japan alliance is the most important alliance the U.S. has, was consequential. Can you expand on that and the role that Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution might play on being a peaceful nation, and how that Article 9 strengthens the alliance?
Peter, certainly, and I can ramble on for a long time on this one. I will probably avoid the Article 9. Specifically, I got in trouble when I first came into this job for opining upon Article 9. That is a Japanese government sovereign decision, so I will try to steer clear of that one. But let me go back to the most important or most consequential for a couple of reasons. One, I talked about the power projection platform. We have 54,000 U.S. forces that are based here in Japan, and they can power project in multiple directions. And with no, and I don't mean this to denigrate anything with any of the other alliances, but when you take a look at how many U.S. forces do we have in Thailand, how many U.S. forces do we have in Australia, how many U.S. forces do we have in Philippines, how many U.S. forces do we have in Korea? By and large, our forward deployed U.S. forces are out here in Japan, and we can go places. Those that in Korea are focused on the Korean Peninsula. You'll have a hard time getting them to go in different directions based on the treaty, the treaty that's between the U.S. and the ROC. So we can power project. The Japanese self-defense forces are extremely capable. And again, I'm going to skirt your Article 9 question, but the fact that we operate similar airframes, F-35, F-15, et cetera, we use largely the same weapons. There's a high level of interoperability between our two forces, and that we're side-by-side training and working together every day. So that's kind of the hard power aspect of it. From a soft power aspect, there's a set of shared values that I think permeates beyond just the U.S. and Japan. Given our history, which goes all the way back to Commodore Perry, and then goes all the way through World War II up to today, the fact that two nations with such a history as ours are so closely linked and closely aligned when it comes to values, I think has a message that a soft power message, which is really, really strong. We believe in transparency in government. We believe in transparency of open and economic systems. We value human rights. We value sovereignty. And I think those messages ring loud and clear, and especially, all the way into Oceania, Taiwan, and other parts of the region and the world. And Japan has pretty solid and outstanding relations, throughout parts of the world, and there's probably places and areas where Japan has more of an influence than the United States. So I do think that there's complementary capabilities that go just beyond our two nations. And I'll stop talking there because I could talk for an hour about the strength of the alliance.
I would just add on, Peter, for the media in Japan, as a former commander, the friendships that General Schneider just described go on for years. It's 12 years since I commanded there, and the fact that we have shared values as a foundation for the incredible friendships that we have between, for example, the Air Force Association and the Japan-America Air Force Goodwill Association. We're constantly engaged. And so the treaty and the shared values sort of speak for themselves when you ask understandable questions about the implications for Article 9. Those values and those shared friendships are big and really sustain the alliance. If I could, and then I'll go to Brian Everstein after this, but Chief McCool, we saw where you just visited Misawa. Not sure if that was your first time there, but given that our theme is Airmen in the Fight, could you talk a little bit about your visit to Misawa from the perspective of our new command chief at 5th Air Force?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the question. No, I had never been to Japan and definitely had never been to Misawa. So it was an incredible experience to go see what our airmen are doing in the fight, how they're communicating with our Navy partners, and just things like how they handle snow. General Kaczynski and I got to go out and drive some of their snow vehicles. And I think spending time with our airmen and just showing that we're willing to see what they're doing is incredibly important, and them feeling empowered and part of the mission.
Thanks, Chief. Leo, anything to offer on your perspective as the Vice of 5th?
Yeah, sir. I think Command Chief covered that. It's not just going on that theme of the friendships and all that. We talked with young airmen there, first assignment ever, especially overseas, and really enjoying it. And then other more senior airmen who've been there second, third time. And so just the relationships, that experience, maybe some apprehension coming to Japan, but once they come here and get that experience, especially with our bilateral partners, it winds up being a place they want to stay at for quite some time.
Well, when I saw you visit, and I see you all visiting Kadena and Misawa, and certainly on the ramp at Yokota, I'm jealous. Carrie and I wish we could go back tonight. Brian Everstein from Air Force Magazine. A question, please, for the team here.
Yes, thank you so much. You can hear me okay, right? Excellent. I was hoping to go down the thread of training and readiness. Since PACAF ended the continuous bomber presence back in the spring, we've seen articles every now and then of, say, a B-1 doing a long-range sortie and linking up with Koko Jeitai or local USAF fighters. Can you talk about this shift to bombers as a DFE employment? Has that increased your capacity to train with them? Has it been about the same? Has there been any change at all?
Hey, Brian, sure. Yeah, I will say that there's a little bit of hand-wringing and angst when the continuous bomber presence closed down and we went to a bomber task force and then the CONUS to CONUS missions. That angst went away really quickly because the number of bomber sorties that are operating in this area have increased. So the ability of Air Force Global Strike Command to project power out to this part of the world has gone up, and the Japanese are extremely appreciative of that. Again, not only because it sends a strong message, because it also increases training opportunities. And I've been pretty pleased that Koko Jeitai leadership looks for more opportunities to train. And, there are a lot of times the focus for some of the initial sorties was to do training, but also to get the photo op, which again, very important that we send that strategic message. But both the Air Defense Command leadership and the Air Chief, or the Chief of the Air Staff Office, in fact, had dinner with both of them last night, wanted to talk about ways that we can continue to do more, to get more tactical employment, more training out of these bomber sorties, and I fully embrace that. I want to look for ways that we can build our capabilities, whether we're using the bombers as training aids for our own capability or looking to employ with them. But I think there's a lot of things that we're going to continue to do and evolve going forward. But this is a good news story.
Thanks, sir. Question from Major General Retired Gary Dean. What is the U.S. Forces Japan posture regarding the evolving trends in the Arctic area? what might be Japan's level of interest or effort in collaboration with U.S. forces pointed towards the Arctic?
Sir, I'll be honest, that conversation has not really come up here. I'll just see if Leo's heard it in his conversations, but I am not tracking the, if it does come up, it's under probably the broader heading of Chinese and Russian malign influence and continuing to look for ways that they can dominate sea lanes. But that question has not been specifically posed to me, or it has not come up in any of the interactions that I've had over.
Well, you certainly have the reach between your two air forces to get there if needed. So Monty Brock, please, and please identify yourself.
Sure. Hi, Monty Brock here. Good to see you again, General Schneider. It's been a while. I'm with Northrop Grumman now, and we've been in discussions with the JASDAF. They've indicated a potential desire to make adjustments to their pilot training to better prepare them for F-35. Is that something that your staff is involved with in guiding them to some of the lessons learned that we've encountered to better prepare for F-35?
I have not had the conversation about that going from pilot training into F-35. I have had the conversation, or we've had the conversation about how coming from other platforms, F4, F2, F-15 into F-35, and some of the challenges there. And I think because the Japanese were still operating the F4 up to a couple weeks ago. One of the concerns that I had was that you go from, with all due respect, maybe a third generation plus fighter to fifth generation, and that is a big step forward. But I have been up to the Integrated Training Center. I've talked to JB Bancroft a couple of times. I'm pretty impressed with the training program that they've got up there. So my concerns or fears about some of the generational transitions have been calmed. But I do think that there's more that we can continue to do. I guess maybe just in terms of fifth generation employment. So as an example, the importance of simulators. And I think that's something that it took us a while, maybe in the U.S. Air Force, to understand that in fifth gen, there's a premium on sim training, because you're going to be able to operate in an environment you may not be able to see in the airspace and get full use of the fifth gen capabilities. So we're continuing to push on that and to highlight, hey, anytime that the doors are open in the sim building, every box needs to be filled, and you're going to make your money probably in the sims, maybe more so than you're going to make in the airspace. So that's maybe not the answer to your question, but that's kind of at least the status of the conversations that we're having right now. Over.
Thanks, sir. Sounds like you'd certainly support investment by the Department of the Air Force in live virtual constructive training, as you saw at Helpville, I'm sure, in Nellis. So I think that's your point.
And so that's a great point. And there is a strong appetite for LVC, and we talk about and we try to show a little bit of what we do. And that is fascinating to Koku Jeitai, and to highlight the fact that, yes, there is an LVC, combined environment where you're going to be able to do a whole lot more than you can do, in the airspace outside of Misawa or Iwakuni or other places. So now the challenge is getting the Japanese to invest and to go after that the same way that we have.
Outstanding. We have a question from one of our very proven Air Force Association volunteers, energized Jeremy Nickel. And Jeremy asked, as AFA, and he's in the Pacific AOR, I think he's at Hickam, but we're trying to stand up an AFA chapter in Tokyo. And across the range of professional development opportunities, direct support to families, are there some key areas that would come to mind, you or Chief McCool, on how AFA can support you as we lean forward to activate a AFA chapter in Tokyo?
Well, sir, my passion for AFA and the time that I've committed to it. I've already made some contacts here about how we can set up the chapter, and then how we can reach back to AFA for communication, just to build that partnership and make it even stronger.
Thanks. We're with you on your wing, and including the stand-up of our new General James Doolittle Leadership Center. we're in support in any initiative you might have across AFA. Let's go to Steve Trimble. Please identify yourself and an opportunity to ask a question. We got a few more minutes here.
Sure. Can you hear me?
You bet.
Great. Well, thank you, General. And good morning to you as well. It's very early there, I'm sure of it. So I was curious about the 18th Wing at Kadena Air Base and the F-15s there with the 2 squadrons. There's a couple options now for replacing those. But how do you see their longevity at Kadena with the F-15 CDs? And what would you like to see them replaced with, F-35As or F-15EXs?
So you're going to get me in trouble. There are ongoing force posture discussions within the Air Force about that question, and I don't want to get ahead of it necessarily. So I'll try to dance around a little. But if with a big capital IF, if F-15s were to go away, I do think there's continued value for 5th generation presence here in Japan. And again, it goes back to the Japanese are going to, outside of the US, the Japanese are going to be the 2nd largest operator of the F-35. Right now, the only F-35s that we have in country are US Marine Corps F-35Bs at Iwakuni. I think it benefits, again, personal opinion, I think there is great benefit for the US Air Force positioning F-35As out here somewhere, Kadena or elsewhere, and I will try not to wade too much farther into a force posture discussion that I probably don't want to have right now. But it is a great question and something that is being worked.
Sir, if you could, sometimes around the world, it's not recognized that we have a very qualified airman leading a joint command. And focused on your emphasis on training and readiness, could you talk a bit about Keen Sword? The recent Keen Sword exercises, obviously joint and bilateral. You lead that exercise as the essentially the sub-unified commander. I think I have that right. But just talk a bit about, if you could, about Keen Sword.
Yes, sir. And I actually was pretty impressed in terms of the scope and scale. I may get the numbers wrong, but I think the JTI forces, Japan Self-Defense Forces from all the branches, when you tally up their involvement, it's roughly around 30,000. Forces that they have participating, and I didn't get to see as much of it as I would have liked, but I did on day one. The chairman of the JJS and I took a AFSOC CV-22s. We flew out to the deck of the Japanese ship Kaga, which is one of their helicopter destroyers. Basically, it's like one of our LHAs, but a little bit smaller. We did a joint press conference, right next to the USS Ronald Reagan, which was conducting flight ops at the time. So, a fantastic, opportunity to show, joint bilateral integration. But some of the highlights for me, for the Keen Sword exercise as a whole, was actually some of the amphibious training that took place. So there was a combined effort with the amphibious ready brigade that the Japanese have, as well as the U.S. Marine Corps, that did an assault island landing, which was a big step forward, I think, for both of our forces. And again, not to overuse the phrase, but a very strong strategic message to others in the region. And there's this underlying theme of the tension in and around the East China Sea, and specifically the Senkakus. But the fact that we can demonstrate something like that, I think sends a clear and strong message to those that would challenge the current status quo down there. But yeah, a lot of good lessons learned that came out of that. And the other thing I'll point out is we were able to take Keen Edge, which is the command post exercise, which happens. We're able to parlay some of those lessons learned into the Keen Sword field training exercise. So we're making steps with building the connective tissue between CPXs and FTXs, which is great.
Well, thanks, sir. We're going to wind up this session and shift to a smaller group session. But for all those with us today that joined, thank you. The cross-section of media and military and industry participants. Your AFA president couldn't be more thankful for all those that joined. And for General Schneider and your team and every member of U.S. Forces Japan and certainly 5th Air Force, thank you for being the most forward deployed, certainly, U.S. military capability to the dawning threat of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and Chinese, both intentions and capabilities. The credibility of your deterrence posture is a combination of your forward deployed position, certainly, the strength of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and your readiness, your combat readiness, and the lethality that the Department of the Air Force can bring to the fight that you are leading. Sir, we can't thank you enough.